Transindividual urbanism. Let me start from shedding some light on what I will not be discussing today. Today, I won't discuss the impact of large-scale human infrastructure on the planet or more economical, smarter, faster ways of master planning our cities. Nor, on the other hand, I will be looking into the potential of self-organized informal strategies. But perhaps, if we observe this picture, this is Johnny Miller, Unequal Scenes, and in particular, the very fine line between the plan and the informal, between the land speculation and the commons, and we think about expanding this line as a terrain of discussion that mingles between the two zones, then we will be closing in. Indeed, we will talk about participation, but in doing so, we won't dwell into the traditional ways of building collaborative knowledge, while we will attempt to address how digitalization is changing these processes and how the notion itself of participation should be expanded to include different levels of agencies and alternative models for aggregation of knowledge and decision-making. A few years ago, I came across a little fascinating publication titled Suspicious Images, Latent Interfaces. The pamphlet, published in 2009, consisted of a quite light-hearted conversation between Benjamin Bratton and Natalie Jeremijenko regarding what the two perceive as the latent potential of big data visualization as political interfaces. A decade later, supported by the widespread notion of ubiquitous computing, this has developed into a general expectation for new forms of distributed authorship. Indeed, Mario Carpo has indicated how the expectation for participatory features in architectural and urban design can be linked to the emergence of computational methods since the early 2000s. I would argue with him that the promise of a digital participation turns seats today still largely unmet. This is true, despite the number of projects that have been recently trying to address the participatory potential of digital fabrication on one side, or on the other, the mechanism of digitalization of participatory urban practices. Wikipedia House represents, for instance, a good example of the idiosyncrasies of current architectural scale online open design and fabrication. The project described enthusiastically by Carlo Ratti in 2015 as an open source platform of housing designs that anyone could download and print with plywood and snap together as an IKEA piece of furniture, sits online today as a barren shelf offering a single house type. The type originally designed as a prototype for the project. Since its launch, the library has been sparsely used while nobody has contributed to this online distributable extension, failing somehow to build any form of direct incorporation of feedback from its final users, the inhabitants of the houses. On the other side, Christian Nold, in a recent paper, 2018, while describing a series of projects that use biometric emotive information for real-time responsive urban planning, builds an interesting critique towards the use of collective feedback dataset. By rendering specific emotional events and as an abstraction and cutting them from their causation through an operation of quantification of qualitative data, this example, he says, sabotage the significance of their findings, trading the possibility of discovering meaningful urban narrative for a misconstructed urban scale real-time responsiveness. Indeed, if a common trait is to be found between this project, this would be the profound disconnection between their agencies, motives, and the proposed materialities and modes of production. My premise is that acquiring a philosophical perspective toward the topic of participation is paramount in order to radically reimagine the cultural and technological basis of the collective project. For this purpose, I draw firstly on the ecological project of Gregory Bateson and on the ideas of subjectivity and communication developed in its form, substance, and difference. Here, Bateson describes information as something that is brought about by differences, as in the case of the territory and the map. where the information that gets onto the map is only given by the discontinuities of the territory, peaks, border, etc. Paths of information, it continues, are not only limited to the body, and despite there are differences between the paths inside and outside the body, the world of information processing is not limited by the skin. If you want to explain anything in human behavior, it continues, you are always dealing with complete circuits of information. The elementary system with its messages in circuits is in fact the simplest unit of mind. The way to delineate the system is to draw the limiting line in a way that you do not cut any of these pathways, which will leave things inexplicable. But while Bateson is fundamental in identifying the concept that entail an ecological redefinition of epistemology, the discussion around the social and political impact of ecologic thinking certainly also needs to take into consideration Gilbert Simondon's theory of collective individuation. This is a critical contribution for its holistic aspiration at connecting psychology to social and behavioral sciences through an original ecological and materialist perspective, a contribution that unfortunately has been only fragmentally published in English. Simondon's published work is actually quite limited. Some of you today actually mentioned one of his, the most famous of his publications. So it is actually confined, so the whole work is actually confined to his doctorate thesis and his complementary dissertation, both wrote in 1958. But while his second dissertation, so the Du mode d'existence, the object techniques, was immediately published and had actually large impact, his main dissertation had a more complicated destiny, with only the first part, l'individu et sa genèse psychobiologique, published in 1964, and the second part, which is what I'm discussing today, l'individuation psychique et collective, was published only in French in 1989 and never published in its entirety in English. There was actually a fraction of it in Incorporation, the book of curated by Sanford Quinter in 1992. And that's how I personally found it. So in his book, Simondon presents his idea of ontology of the collective subject in the form of its ontogenesis. For him, the process of individuation of the subject is a continuous process of development that evolves through different metastatic stages. Meta beyond state of stability. So the first step of this process is what he described as physical individuation. Here he offered the example of the genesis of the crystals, where the process of individuation is not given by a combination of given form and matter, but with a resolution from the inside of a metastatic system with a rich latent potential. Further, Simondon describes the individuation of the living subject as a process of individuation in which the subject keeps a certain permanent ability to new individuations. Not only he is the result of the individuation as the crystal and the molecule, but the theater of the individuation itself. With an analog hypothesis of the one of quantum physics, Simondon continues, it's then possible to imagine that a regime of metastability might be conveyed by the individual and that participation might consist of a larger process of individuation itself. The psychic individuation and the collective individuation are the two following steps that describe the internal and external relations of the individual, and that together describe the transindividual, a new type of collective subjectivity that, born from an authentic new operation of individuation, lives in its own changes on the basis of its own specific metastaticity. So, In this perspective, knowledge is also redefined through a problematic deriving from a primary tropistic unique, a coupling of sensation and tropism. Information is never found, but always result out of the tension between two different realities that comes together as a system. With this reconceptualization of ideas of subjectivity, knowledge as information, Simondon not only offered the basis for reconsidering the process of becoming collective and building collective knowledge, but with this transversal materialistic ecological approach, he indicates a perspective through which a novel, post-human, and distributed form of authorship can be explored. By opening the digital participatory scholarship to ecological and post-humanist theory, my works aim at offering a better understanding of the complex nature of collective feedback and creating the potential for the affirmation of novel mediated urban narrative and aesthetics. These ideas are explored through a design research practice that uses participatory urban analysis and digital design speculation to explore the aesthetical, technological, and cultural dimension of transindividuality as a generative model for collective authorship. The HeartBit Walks was developed for the London Festival of Architecture 2018 as a series of psychogeographic group exploration in East London. An initial workshop took place at the Bartlett School of Architecture, Master of Urban Design, to develop an Arduino portable apparatus that, drawing on methods developed by the artist, Christian Nold, was designed to collect combined galvanic skin response, an indicator of the motive status also used in lie detecting test, and GPS signals. The project continued as a two-day public event involving 25 participants who were invited to wear the apparatus during explorative group walks across the newly redeveloped Olympic Park and the neighboring Hackney Wick. The detailed emotional insights were visualized during in-situ group discussion, placing the focus on the individual versus summative experiences, visualized three-dimensional models and dynamics animation. The accident perceived by each participant were classified through an identification of the primary and secondary sense through which the events were perceived. For example, an encounter with noisy school children on a bridge was identified as sound sight. In particular, 6 group walks were analyzed and rendered through overall maps and the overlays of individual GSR data and the different event recorded. In the overall, this visualization composed a rich visual index that, by rendering the differently able perspective with granular definitions, offer a multiscalar photography of the experience. Not only, in fact, the diverse identities of the participant and the details of how their physical and mental abilities affected their experience are revealed, but through the vertical sensual categorization of the events in court, the different experiences are compared and interwoven in a collective visual diary rich of indication and urban insights. Drawing on the body of knowledge developed for the HeartBit Walks, the Affectual infrastructure project was developed for the E17 Art Trail, again in London this year. Through a call on social media, 6 environmental activists were recruited. The participants, a mix of academics, architects, landscape designers, visual artists, and psychologists, were asked to choose a location resonating with their own work and message, where we met to record a 3-minute speech together with the concurrent environmental sound and the participant GSR signal. With the intent to detect common sonic, spatial, and emotional connection, data patterns were observed at group level. Here on the group GSR overlay are highlighted moment or relative peak calm for each participant, identifying points of emotional connection between the various participants at different times. Further, these connective patterns were analyzed within their spatial arrangement. A multi-objective genetic algorithm was run to search for optimal solution to 3 concurrent goals. Finding GSR points or solutions as close as possible to each other, emotional proximity, finding solution with the lowest GSR values, moment of calm, and finding solution as close as possible to each other, time proximity. The results informed a spatial multimedia installation that materialized for the public the layer-situated experience of the participant. Working as an adaptive network, the piece was set to release 6 ambient and speech recordings, edited with an overlay structure, responding to the recorded emotional status of each participant, and the ones emotionally close to him at particular points in time. In conclusion, the production of urban space has for a long time now looked at environmental sensing to create responsive developmental strategies. While fascinated for the depth of knowledge created, this perspective tends to ascribe human subjectivity to an isolated and sanitized position. With an ecological angle that places humans and their living and non-living co-species as the network of actors that collaboratively addresses the production of space, the 2 projects presented today use biometric senses for a systematic deconstruction of the human agency and the reimagination of metastatic processes for the creation of actionable group knowledge. By looking at the construction of sensual collective knowledge that maintains traceable ties with the events and the narrative that produce the biometric reaction, the results also introduce a process of open attribution of significance that radically challenge previously conceived ideas of digital distributed authorship for the urban environment, with the potential of radically reshape the processes through which culture and places connect locally. Thank you.